This video is a summary of the videos I have in a playlist on the physiology of the respiratory system. So, sorry, the light's coming through the blinds. Obviously, if you would like more information on any of these points, these individual videos go through the points in greater detail. So after talking about, breathing muscles and getting air in and out of the lungs, I think a lot of students, ask, are we done with this chapter? And the answer is no. Because if you get air in and out of the lungs, what good has that done the brain or the arm or the leg? None. And so there has to be more steps in this process. And so there is gas exchange, which occurs in between the air in the alveolus and the blood in the capillaries in the lungs, the pulmonary capillaries. This is what we call external respiration. And in a previous video, talking about, the heart, I had said, if these pulmonary arteries bring blue deoxygenated blood to these capillaries, what happens as these capillaries run along the alveoli is the carbon dioxide leaves and oxygen enters. When oxygen binds hemoglobin, it changes its hue. So now we have red oxygenated blood, which is leaving the capillaries of the lungs, different from the blue deoxygenated blood, which arrived there. So this is the gas exchange which occurs in external respiration in the pulmonary capillaries in the lungs. And then the red oxygenated blood goes to the left atrium, which goes to the left ventricle. The left ventricle squeezes this blood and sends it to the brain and back, hand and back, foot and back. And it then these systemic arteries have red oxygenated blood. This red oxygenated blood reaches the capillaries of, say, the brain, the hand, the foot. And the oxygen leaves to give the brain the oxygen it needs, the hand, the foot, the oxygen they need, and the carbon dioxide, which had built up in these tissues, then comes into the blood. So here we have another gas exchange, but now the oxygen is leaving the capillary and carbon dioxide is coming in, the opposite of what we had just described. And this is what is called internal respiration. And so there are two steps after pulmonary ventilation. In one, what's called external respiration, there's a gas exchange between the air sac and the blood. So here we see oxygen going into the blood in external respiration, while at the same time, carbon dioxide would then be leaving the blood. And so in external respiration, oxygen is coming into the blood from the air sac. Carbon dioxide is leaving the blood going into the air sac. So these gases are moving in opposite directions. So this is what is occurring in the external respiration, which occurs in the lungs. When we look at the tissues, here you see that oxygenated blood reaches the tissues and oxygen leaves the blood to go to the tissues, and the carbon dioxide, which is built up in the tissues, then enters the blood. So this is internal respiration. Once again, these gases are moving in opposite directions, but now the oxygen is leaving the blood and the carbon dioxide is entering. Why? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is the idea of partial pressures. Now, partial pressures and the law in physics where the total pressure of a gas is made up of all of the partial pressures. So for example, in the air that we breathe, there's nitrogen, there's oxygen, there's carbon dioxide, there's water vapor. And so all of the pressure in the air, the total air pressure, is equal to the sum of the pressure from nitrogen, the pressure from oxygen, the pressure from carbon dioxide and water vapor, et cetera. If there was a whole bunch of people, in a room banging up against the walls, the total pressure, of people banging up against the walls would be the sum of everyone who's wearing a green shirt, everyone who's wearing a blue shirt, et cetera. So the green shirt people, that's part of the whole, that's a partial pressure. The blue shirt people, that's part of the whole, that's a partial pressure. The total pressure would be the sum of all of these. Well, lucky for us, gases will move from an area of high partial pressure to low. Once again, I realized that just talking in this way might have lost half the class. But the reality is that's wonderful. And the reason it's wonderful is if oxygen is moving. So for example, here in external respiration, if you were to measure the partial pressure of oxygen in the air sac, it's 105 millimeters of mercury. If you measure it in the deoxygenated blood reaching the lungs, it's 40 millimeters of mercury. If you ask the question, where will oxygen go? It goes from where its gas has a high partial pressure to an area of low partial pressure. All right. So what is nitrogen doing? Oxygen doesn't care. What is carbon dioxide doing? Oxygen doesn't care. Oxygen is going to go from an area of high partial pressure to an area of low partial pressure. So here's the beauty of talking about partial pressures. It means that if we'd like to talk about oxygen for a while, we can, because oxygen acts as if all of the other gases weren't present. Once we're done talking about oxygen, we can talk about carbon dioxide, because carbon dioxide acts as if the other gases weren't present. So here, once again, if the oxygen rushes into the blood, and the deoxygenated blood, which once had a partial pressure of oxygen gas of 40 millimeters of mercury, and now it rises to 105 millimeters of mercury. If we send this red oxygenated blood to tissues, then the oxygen will simply go from the area of high partial pressure, the oxygenated blood, which is in the systemic capillary, to the low partial pressure of, say, 40 millimeters of mercury in a resting tissue, but it can be 20 millimeters of mercury or lower in an active tissue. So once again, there are these numbers, we're talking laws of physics, and I know a lot of students get turned off by this, but really we're saying two things. One, this oxygen gas is going to go from the high number to the low number. And because it is following its partial pressure gradient, we don't have to worry about any other gas. It would be so much more complicated if we did. If we had to simultaneously say, wait, before we talk about oxygen, what is carbon dioxide doing? What is nitrogen doing? We don't. All right, so we can just focus on the oxygen. So this idea of partial pressure is actually a friend of ours, and it's quite easy. Even if you see numbers, say, oh, what numbers? All you have to know is the gas is going to go from the big number to the little number. In the same way, carbon dioxide is going to go from an area of high partial pressure to low. So here we are in the tissue where the carbon dioxide has a partial pressure of 45 millimeters of mercury. In the deoxygenated blood of a systemic capillary, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 40. And so carbon dioxide in the tissues in internal respiration goes from the tissues into the capillary blood, going from 45 to 40. Thus then, the deoxygenated blood, as it leaves the tissues, has a partial pressure of 45 millimeters of mercury. In an air sac, the partial pressure is 40 millimeters of mercury. And so now carbon dioxide is just going to go from the area of high partial pressure to low partial pressure, 45 to 40. And so thus these gases can be moving in opposite directions, because oxygen is going from an area of high partial pressure to low, which drives it into the capillary, while carbon dioxide is going from an area of high partial pressure to low, which is driving it out of the capillary. Okay. Now, what I've just said is so very important, right? Because it is the gaseous oxygen which is moving. So oxygen gas goes from here to there, or in the tissues, leaves the plasma, goes to the tissues. Carbon dioxide, it is the gaseous form which is moving. All right, so that is true, and that's why we worry about the gas. That's the form in which it moves. However, not much oxygen gas can dissolve in blood plasma because it's mostly water. Oxygen gas is non-polar. Carbon dioxide gas is non-polar. But blood plasma is mostly water, which is polar. Now, if you think of Italian salad dressing, the polar and the non-polar don't mix. And so here, if you ask how much of the oxygen gas is actually, how much of the oxygen in your blood is actually traveling as a gas, it's really only about 1.5%. Well, how's the rest of it, being transported? Well, that's where the red blood cells come in and their hemoglobin. 98.5% of the oxygen in your blood right now is bound to hemoglobin. Why? Because this nonpolar oxygen doesn't dissolve well in polar water. Unless we carry the oxygen, we're not going to get enough oxygen in our blood plasma that we can use to breathe. And so when we talk about oxygen, even though the gaseous part is very important, this is how oxygen is moving back and forth. As it is transported, 98.5% of the oxygen is traveling bound to hemoglobin. 1.5% is traveling as a gas. As we will see, I just want to go through this video so we can move through the videos in the playlist. With carbon dioxide, we'll see the same thing, but with one added feature. Carbon dioxide can travel as a gas. 7% of the carbon dioxide can travel that way. Carbon dioxide can bind to hemoglobin, just like the heme of hemoglobin can bind oxygen. The protein part, the globin part, can bind carbon dioxide. And that transports 23% of the carbon dioxide in your blood. But while these two measures, the gas and the amount bound to hemoglobin, added up to 100% of the oxygen in your blood, this 7 and that 23 only add up to 30%. So most of the carbon dioxide in your blood is traveling in a third form, in the form of bicarbonate. Now, obviously, we'll be explaining that in just a few videos. But once again, because carbon dioxide is nonpolar, the majority of it is not traveling as this nonpolar gas, because nonpolar gases don't mix with polar water very well. So we need to bind it to the globin portion of hemoglobin, or have this other way that it travels. Okay. Now, in this lecture that I give, the least favorite part of it by far with my students is this. So if, as I go through this, if you're a little annoyed and not overly fond of it, you are perfectly normal. So if oxygen is sometimes binding hemoglobin and sometimes letting go of hemoglobin, we need a way to then express how much oxygen is bound to hemoglobin, how much has been released. So in other words, we need to talk about hemoglobin saturation. So of this hemoglobin, and just for artistic simplicity's sake, this one hemoglobin molecule will represent all of the hemoglobin molecules in a red blood cell and all of the red blood cells at that part of the capillary. So obviously there's a lot of red blood cells. Each one can have 250 million of these. But let's just have one single molecule represent all of the other ones for simplicity's sake. So we could measure, is there any oxygen stuck there, or there? Well, no, then we would be at 0% hemoglobin saturation. So the saturation would say go from 0 to 100. So let's say if one oxygen is bound, that would be say 25% saturated in this artistic representation. One of the four is represented. If oxygen binds two of these, then we would be at 50%, three of them 75%. If oxygen binds to all four, that would then represent 100% hemoglobin saturation. Now on the bottom here, we see partial pressure of oxygen. And notice there's no oxygen floating around. So if there's no oxygen, then the partial pressure of oxygen is 0. And when the partial pressure of oxygen is 0, the saturation is 0. So if there's no oxygen around, there's not going to be any oxygen which is bound to hemoglobin. So if we start to see the partial pressure increase, so if the partial pressure of oxygen starts to go up, we reach a point where here there's more oxygen than there used to be. So let's say the partial pressure, is around here. But now look, some of the oxygen has bound hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is now 25% saturated. As there's more oxygen molecules floating around, we'll get to a point where hemoglobin is 50% saturated. Look, and once again, this one molecule is representing all of the hemoglobin molecules, just to artistically make it easier to grasp. And so as then there's more, and notice, now we're going up on this curve. So we were 25% saturated, 50% saturated. Now we're going up. As there is more oxygen in the vicinity, we get to 75% saturated, we'll get to 100% saturated. And so when there's enough oxygen in the environment, when the partial pressure of oxygen is 100. Now, if we wanted to split hairs, technically this graph should go up to 105 because that's the partial pressure of oxygen at sea level. So if you're standing on the Jersey Shore, and if you ask what's the partial pressure of oxygen in the air right now, it would be 105. But it's obviously easy to have a graph go from 0 to 100, so let's just use that. If you're at the Jersey Shore, all right, where the partial pressure of oxygen is, say, 100, your hemoglobin is 100% saturated with oxygen. All right. Now, here's the thing. This curve could take lots of forms. This is the curve that represents the relationship between the saturation of hemoglobin and the partial pressure of oxygen. As the partial pressure of oxygen went up, the saturation went up, but it went up in such a way that we have a curve that looks like this. Now, this curve could look like anything, right? It could go this way, it could be a straight line, there could be lots of curves, but this curve looks like this. That's important. Hemoglobin has been tinkered with for technically billions of years. So if hemoglobin interacts with oxygen to make a curve look like this, it's not some random thing. This is what your body's hemoglobin wants. Your hemoglobin wants to interact with oxygen in a way that the relationship between partial pressure and saturation looks like this, which means that there are two special parts of this curve that aren't there by accident, they're there on purpose. One, notice up here, the curve tends to be kind of flat. All right, not all curves have this flat plateau up top. For example, we could have an exponential, curve looking like this. That's a flat plateau. We need to explain why hemoglobin wants that, okay? Why is that adaptive to have a flat plateau up here? And because we have a flat plateau up here, that means that here we have a steep slope. Why is that adaptive? So I'm going to have to explain that why this curve looks exactly the way it does. Why do we have a flat plateau and why do we have a steep slope here? Okay, because they're both very important. So let's get to the flat plateau. Let's say that you go to Jersey, all right, and I'm from Pennsylvania, I teach in New York, and so the Jersey Shore, that's our reference. And so you go to the Jersey Shore, and because you're at sea level, your partial pressure of oxygen is 100, and at the Jersey Shore, now your hemoglobin saturation is 100%. Your hemoglobin is holding as much oxygen as it can as it leaves your lungs. Okay, well, let's say you leave the Jersey Shore and you go to mountains, all right, maybe little mountains like the Catskills, the Pocono Mountains, the Adirondack Mountains. Maybe you go to Colorado and you go to, much bigger mountains, all right. Well, now the problem is, the air is thinner. So how much oxygen is in the air? Well, it's not a partial pressure of oxygen of 100. That was at sea level in Jersey, all right. You're not getting 100 when you're up in the mountains. All right. I mean, in extreme cases, when I was in the Peace Corps, the first time I went, we briefly landed in La Paz, Bolivia, which is the highest international airport in the world. Everyone was breathing like this, just sitting there. So as we go up in altitude, the air is thinner. There is less oxygen in the air. So let's say that now you're up in the mountains and the partial pressure of oxygen is not 100 anymore, it's 80. That's a huge drop. That's 20%. That's a fifth less oxygen in the air. So if there's a fifth less oxygen in the air, how much has the hemoglobin saturation of oxygen gone down? Well, if we look at our graph, we go to 80. All right, we're not quite at 100%. Maybe we're at 96. But a 20% drop here has led to like a minimal drop here, maybe 4%. So that's the beauty of having this flat curve. Because it's a flat plateau up top, If you go up in altitude, or if you have a mild respiratory disorder and the partial pressure of oxygen decreases, your hemoglobin is still about as full as it can be. So even if you're at a higher altitude, even if you have a mild respiratory disorder, you still have about as much hemoglobin bound to oxygen as you would if you were healthy on the Jersey Shore. All right, so that's a neat trick. And that's what this flat part of the curve gives us. Even at a higher altitude or with a mild respiratory disorder, our hemoglobin is still about 100% saturated. For this next part, just to liven up, the class, which isn't loving all of the time we spend on this curve, what I do in the class is I take a moment. It's not going to work here, but I grab a chair and I'll lift it with one arm. All right, and I'll say, so I'd like you to think about my, my right arm, which is holding the chair, and now think of my left arm, which isn't. So in this demonstration, one of my arms is obviously at rest, it's just hanging there, but one of my arms is holding something up, okay? And so let's talk about my resting arm first. So my left ventricle now has oxygenated blood that's 100% saturated. And this then gets sent to the arm that is resting. When it gets to the resting arm, all right, so here we have hemoglobin. It used to be 100% saturated. All of these hemes were bound to oxygen. But when it gets to my resting arm, what happens is oxygen leaves and goes to my resting arm. And that's nice because my resting arm needs oxygen. These muscles need oxygen. They get oxygen. But not only oxygen. Notice that the hemoglobin which will leave my resting arm still has 3/4 of the oxygen attached to it. It's still 75% saturated. So my resting arm got some oxygen, but only a little, only about 25% of the oxygen that hemoglobin was carrying. All right. Now, in contrast, when I send my blood to the arm that's holding up the chair, all right, here, because I'm doing so much exercise, the partial pressure of oxygen in my active tissue is not what it was in the resting tissue. I'm sorry, I forgot that. I should have mentioned this. So in my resting arm, the partial pressure of oxygen is 40, all right? And so notice here at 40, the partial pressure of oxygen, this is a resting tissue, it's higher. When I get to a active tissue, like my arm that was holding something up, now the partial pressure is 20. At this higher level of activity, all right, because I'm using so much more oxygen, the partial pressure is less. So in the active tissue, my active arm needed more oxygen. And so notice that it was given more oxygen. Hemoglobin let go of 75% of the oxygen that it was carrying. So as this goes back to my heart, there might still be a little oxygen left. Notice that it is still 25% saturated. But the reason it's not 100% saturated is that 75% of the oxygen that hemoglobin was carrying then went to the tissue. That's what the steep slope gives us. The resting tissue got 25% of the oxygen being carried by hemoglobin. The active tissue got 75% of the oxygen that hemoglobin was carrying. But notice that the difference between my resting arm at 40 millimeters of mercury partial pressure and my active arm at 20 is 20 millimeters of mercury. This difference of 20 made almost no difference, 100 to say 96%. So here we dropped a partial pressure of oxygen of 20 millimeters of mercury and it had pretty much no effect. Here we dropped a partial pressure of 20 and it had a huge effect. The active tissue is getting 75% of the oxygen that hemoglobin carries, while the resting tissue only got 25%. And so that the way that hemoglobin interacts with oxygen is very adaptive, And it's been tinkered with to give just this relationship so that the curve depicting this relationship looks just like that. Okay. So when I'm teaching, we go through the hemoglobin saturation curve, and my students think we're done. We go to the next image, and it's more curves, which they're thrilled about. But I've kind of represented the additional curves that we could so we could ask, what would the curve look like in exercise when the tissue is more acidic? What would it look at a higher temperature? So there could be more curves, but instead I'd like to represent it this way. So one of the points from the previous section was that hemoglobin will let go of more oxygen in an active tissue, which needs more oxygen. And the reason was that the partial pressure of oxygen was lower. The active tissue, which was lifting the chair, had a lower partial pressure of oxygen than the resting tissue, which wasn't lifting a chair. And so this is what the body wants. You want oxygen to go to where it is needed. So notice that the active tissue lifting the chair gets more oxygen than the resting tissue because of a lower partial pressure of oxygen. But wait, there's more. Because hemoglobin will not only let go of more oxygen when it's in a tissue with a lower partial pressure of oxygen, hemoglobin is also affected by acid. So when hemoglobin reaches a tissue which is more acidic, it will let go of more oxygen, all right? Which is good because active tissues are acidic. Active tissues, say, may be building up lactic acid. And so hemoglobin is also programmed so that it will release more oxygen where oxygen is needed in an acidic tissue. Hemoglobin will also release more oxygen when the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is higher. So where there's a greater partial pressure of carbon dioxide, also the hemoglobin lets go of more oxygen. Hemoglobin does the same in warmer tissues. In a warmer tissue, hemoglobin will let go of more oxygen. So when you're exercising, the muscles, which are working out very hard, they need more oxygen. And they get more oxygen because the muscles which are active, they have a lower partial pressure of oxygen because they're using it. They are more acidic because they're building up lactic acid. They have a higher partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and they're warmer. All of those four independently cause hemoglobin to let go more oxygen. So active tissues, I have the same blood going to both arms. But if one arm is working out and the other arm isn't, the active tissue gets far more oxygen delivered to it than the resting tissue did because that's a lower partial pressure of oxygen. It's more acidic, it has a higher partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and it is warmer. We could even throw in additional ones if we wanted to, like there are hormones like epinephrine that we might release, which could actually cause this to be greater as well. And so because of partial pressures, we can focus on one at a time, and we're focusing on oxygen. Just a couple final points. As we will see when we talk about fetal development, fetuses have a bunch of challenges. One of them is that a mother's source of oxygen is her lungs, and the capillaries in her lungs are 100% saturated. A fetus's source of oxygen is the placenta. The placenta is a tissue, a systemic tissue, where the partial pressure of oxygen might be 40. So the fetal source of oxygen has a lower partial pressure of oxygen than the maternal source. So that's a challenge. How does the fetus get enough oxygen? Well, one of the tricks is that fetal hemoglobin is different than maternal hemoglobin. Maternal hemoglobin has alpha and beta chains, whereas fetal hemoglobin has alpha and gamma chains. It doesn't interact with this other molecule called BPG all that much, and so as a result, it binds oxygen more tightly. It has a different chain. It doesn't interact with BPG. It binds oxygen more tightly. So in the placenta, You have the maternal blood, which brought the oxygen there. And then the fetal blood, which is going to leave the placenta. But if you were to ask, since it was the maternal blood that brought the oxygen there, if you were to compare then the saturation of hemoglobin in the maternal blood leaving the placenta versus the fetal blood leaving the placenta, you would find that the maternal blood is maybe 25% saturated. The fetal blood is maybe 75% saturated. So as these two sources of blood go away from the placenta, the fetal hemoglobin has a higher saturation of oxygen, even though it was the maternal hemoglobin that brought the oxygen there. That's a neat trick. So the fetal hemoglobin leaves with more oxygen than the maternal blood leaves with, which is a neat trick since the maternal blood was the source of the oxygen. We could get into other concepts about oxygen. So oxygen is dangerous. Now, we obviously need it for life, but if you could breathe pure oxygen at a higher pressure, you would die. And that being said, oxygen might contribute to our deaths anyway. Reactive forms of oxygen, those ROS, reactive oxygen species, they do contribute to heart disease, to asthma, to lots of negative health outcomes. Many of us who worry about our health, say you've had, say heart attacks or you're worried about asthma, you now may be taking antioxidants. Oh, this is rich in antioxidants. We want to counteract those reactive forms of oxygen. So oxygen can be dangerous, just a final point to be made. And then also this hemoglobin, it's great at binding oxygen. Unfortunately, it's even better at binding other things like carbon monoxide. That's why I don't want to breathe carbon monoxide. I don't want to be in traffic. I don't want to be in a closed room where there's a fireplace that is invented to the outside, or where there's an internal combustion engine running in a garage. Because when that happens, carbon monoxide binds to hemoglobin, but it doesn't let go. Oxygen binds to hemoglobin and then lets go. But carbon monoxide binds 200 times better than oxygen does. And so if I'm breathing in carbon monoxide, eventually so much of my heme units have bound carbon monoxide, I can't bind enough oxygen and I can suffocate and die. So, a couple final points on oxygen. Thanks to partial pressures, we can talk about carbon dioxide. And as you recall, carbon dioxide moves from an area of high partial pressure to low, just as oxygen did. It can travel as a gas. It can travel bound to the globin portion of hemoglobin. But then there was this one other thing that we didn't mention. This next chemical equation, it's important. It actually pops up in the digestive system chapter, the urinary system chapter, the fluids chapter. So this is an equation which pops up in 4 different chapters. Water and carbon dioxide can interact to form carbonic acid, and then carbonic acid dissociates. We know it does because that's what acids do. Just the fact that I said that was an acid. We knew that it would release a hydrogen ion, and what's left over afterwards is called bicarbonate. So if, and for example, something you could do in a lab, let's say you had a solution that had a pink acid indicator, so that when it became acid, the solution changed color to yellow. All right, so it starts off pink, and if you add acid, it turns yellow. If you were to blow bubbles into the solution, you would see the pink go away and it would become yellow. And you ask, wait, I blew bubbles. Why did it turn yellow? Well, because it became acidic. Why did it become acidic? Because carbon dioxide in your exhaled air becomes carbonic acid, which then separates, and it was these hydrogen ions that's the definition of acid, having hydrogen ions. And then that changed the acidity of that solution. But when the hydrogen ion leaves carbonic acid, what we're left with is bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is the form in which 70% of the carbon dioxide in your blood is traveling, all right? So oxygen travels 2 ways as a gas and bound to hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide travels 3 ways as a gas, bound to hemoglobin, and then also in the form of bicarbonate. Now, as we'll see, when this gets to the lungs, these reactions can go in the reverse direction as well. So a hydrogen ion can then bind bicarbonate. This forms carbonic acid. Then the carbonic acid can dissociate, becoming water and carbon dioxide. And then carbon dioxide can then go into your air sac and then come out your nose. And so it can travel through your blood as bicarbonate, right? But then it can become carbon dioxide once again. So when blood gets to a tissue, carbon dioxide from the tissue goes into the blood, and it then travels these three different ways. So it travels as bound as a gas, bound to hemoglobin, but then it also interacts with water to form carbonic acid, dissociates to form bicarbonate. Then when we get to the lungs in external respiration, what you just saw in the tissue was internal respiration. In external respiration, the bicarbonate binds to hydrogen ions, becomes carbonic acid. It dissociates again to become water and carbon dioxide, and then the carbon dioxide can then go into the air sac and come out your nose. Okay. So the next set of videos, I'm just going to go through them very quickly. I like them. I ask my students to, kind of do an activity with them, just to kind of make it interesting or to liven up the class. When I speak as an oxygen atom or as a carbon dioxide or an oxygen molecule as a carbon dioxide molecule, I speak with different accents, just to liven it up. So sorry if that's something you feel, you have to deal with. So in any case, how does oxygen get to my tissues? Well, first it's going to come into the nasal cavity, then into the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, the laryngopharynx. Then it enters the larynx, the trachea, and then it goes through the bronchi, the primary bronchi, the secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, goes to bronchioles, then the air sacs. And so one thing, we could trace this oxygen molecule, which starts off in the air, but will end up in the air sacs where it then goes into the alveoli. We could talk about what it experiences along the way. Obviously, when it's in the nasal cavity, it's swirling around. And as it swirls around, remember that those conchae cause the air to swirl around. Then notice there's all of these other things in the air. There might be germs or dust or diesel particles. These get caught in mucus. Remember, we have goblet cells, which are making mucus. And then we have cilia, which sweeps this mucus towards the throat. We then swallow this mucus full of gunk into the stomach so that the delicate lung tissue doesn't have to deal with it. And so that's what's happening in this video, which, sorry, zoom in, the videos, slow each other down. So then as the air goes by, notice that more and more of the gunk is caught in mucus, and now it's just oxygen. And then as we get to this next video, this is external respiration. In external respiration, oxygen is going from the air sac into the plasma. Why? Well, that's easy. Oh, I'm sorry. So here it is traveling, some more. I just go through that again. As it then then travels in external respiration, we see that it goes from an area of high partial pressure to low. So the partial pressure in the air sac is maybe 100. The partial pressure of here in the blood plasma is maybe 40. If this is the deoxygenated blood, which has arrived here, oh, and I apologize. I just realized the partial pressure of oxygen is 100. My fault. What I meant to say is that in my alveoli in Jersey, it would be 100. It would actually be a little higher in the outside air. So sorry if you're looking at a minor change. So the partial pressure of oxygen in the air sac is 100. And if I'm at the Jersey Shore, once again, slightly higher in the outside air. Sorry about that. And the partial pressure here is 40. And so oxygen, as you can see, is going from an area of high partial pressure to low from the air in the alveolus into the blood capillary. Now, while the gas is coming into the blood plasma in external respiration, not a lot of this not a lot of the non-polar oxygen gas can dissolve in the polar plasma. And that's why we have red blood cells with hemoglobin. The hemoglobin binds oxygen, and as such, 98.5% of the oxygen that's going to be transported through the blood is actually bound to hemoglobin. Only 1.5% of the oxygen traveling through your blood is going to remain as a gas. So it's all a gas here, all right, but the blood can't hold that much of a gas. So most of it will then bind the hemoglobin molecules here. So in external respiration, that's what's happening. The gas is going from an area of high partial pressure to low into the plasma, and then in the plasma, it then is bound to hemoglobin because not much is going to travel as a plasma. So these animations, I actually like them. They came out well. You might want to just watch it just to get that mental image of what's happening during external respiration. And then we get this red oxygenated blood, and we send it to the tissues of our body. In the tissues now, say a brain, if this is the brain, the tissue then has a low partial pressure of oxygen, maybe 40 at rest, even lower, 20 or even lower during activity. So here the oxygen is going to leave the hemoglobin. Hemoglobin has bound oxygen, right? But remember that curve, that now that the surrounding tissue has a lower partial pressure of oxygen, hemoglobin lets go. And so here in this animation, you'll see oxygen is leaving the hemoglobin, going into the plasma. And then once it's in the plasma in gaseous form, it can then go from the plasma in the capillary into the tissue, because it's going from an area of high partial pressure to low. So this is internal respiration. In internal respiration, the hemoglobin lets go of oxygen. It then becomes a gas, and then the oxygen goes from an area of high partial pressure, leaving the capillary, going to the and then be absorbed by cellular respiration, which is another chapter. So that's oxygen. We started off in the outside air. We followed the respiratory system, then respiration that occurred in your lungs, and now here you're seeing internal respiration. Then we could do the same for carbon dioxide. So if we start off in the brain tissue, all right, the brain is active, and it then builds up carbon dioxide, which then needs to leave. So carbon dioxide is in the brain tissue, and so we then see it diffuse, going from an area of high partial pressure to low into the plasma. All right, so gases, once again, go from an area of high partial pressure to low, while oxygen is going to the brain. Carbon dioxide is at a higher partial pressure. It then comes into the blood plasma, and you can see that animation flow. And then here, we realize that while some of the carbon dioxide can travel as a gas, it can, not much can, because carbon dioxide is nonpolar and the water in plasma is polar. So that's where the red blood cells come in. A lot of the carbon dioxide will bind the globin portion of hemoglobin, but then this accounts only for 30% of the carbon dioxide, some traveling as a gas, some traveling bound to globin. But then we will also see some of it react with water, become carbonic acid, and then the carbonic acid dissociates to form bicarbonate. And so bicarbonate is the form in which 70% of the carbon dioxide is traveling. So as carbon dioxide goes from the tissue and is now going to enter the blood and now travel to the lungs, it travels in three ways. Some as a gas, some bound to globin, and some in the form of bicarbonate, maybe 7%, 23%, and 70%. Now, just so you know, there's another minor point, that as we have the positive acid leaving, since red blood cells are helping this happen, red blood cells help to make carbonic acid and then pump out the acid. A cell can't do that for long. If you build up, positive ions, that's going to change, your internal, balance. So the red blood cells help this happen. They have an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase, which helps make carbon dioxide even faster than it would otherwise happen. But they can't build up all the acid. So what they do is they pump the acid out. but another positive ion comes in called chloride. All right, and so there's going to be a chloride shift here in green. As the acid is leaving, the chloride is coming in and changes its place. That way the red blood cells can continue to do that. That's known as the chloride shift, which I mention again in a second. That's a minor point. And so this was the result of internal respiration in your tissues, like your brain tissue, your arm tissue. Carbon dioxide came in as a gas, some bound to globin. A lot of it became bicarbonate inside red blood cells, and then went into the plasma. And now in the plasma, carbon dioxide is then traveling in these three forms. Now, when we get to the lungs for external respiration, the air sac has a lower level of carbon dioxide. So now the gas can diffuse, going from an area of high partial pressure in the plasma to the lower partial pressure of the alveolus. As the gas leaves, then the carbon dioxide, which is bound to hemoglobin, can leave and then become a gas, which then leaves. And then that bicarbonate reverses. So the bicarbonate goes into red blood cells, becomes becomes carbonic acid, which then becomes carbon dioxide, which can leave. Now, once again, there's a chloride shift. All right, so as now the hydrogen ions are coming in to make carbon dioxide, again, the chloride leaves. But this is what's happening in the external respiration in the lungs, where the carbon dioxide bound to hemoglobin is leaving, carbonate is becoming carbon dioxide again. And so external respiration and internal respiration are kind of opposite versions of each other. So here in the air sac, then the carbon dioxide is going from an area of high partial pressure to low as it goes into the alveolus. And from there, the carbon dioxide can travel from the air sac through the bronchioles to the tertiary bronchi, secondary bronchi, primary bronchi, to the trachea, to the larynx, to the pharynx, to the nasal cavity, and then come out your nose. And so that is how carbon dioxide, which starts in your tissues, can then end up going into your the organs of your respiratory tract, and then leaving through your. So that was a description of how oxygen and carbon dioxide move in internal and external respiration. But then we realized, wait a minute, 79% of the air that I'm breathing, that's nitrogen gas. Don't we have to talk about that as well? And the answer is quite frankly, not much. The reason is hydrogen gas forms what are called single covalent bonds, where each atom shares one electron. Oxygen gas is a far stronger bond. It forms double covalent bonds, where each atom shares two electrons. It's a double covalent bond. But nitrogen gas is far stronger. Each gas atom is sharing 3 electrons with its partner. Big picture is that's a much stronger bond. All right, it is so strong that we can't break it. Now, we need nitrogen. DNA and RNA, they have nitrogenous bases. So in this image that you're going to see, the nitrogen, they are the pink atoms. So DNA needs a lot of nitrogen. Every amino acid in a protein has an amino group. All right, so the pink atoms that you see there, that's the nitrogen. All right, and so we need nitrogen. And you're thinking, oh, well, that's not a problem because I'm breathing so much of it. All right, so 70%, 79% of the air that I'm breathing is nitrogen. But that's not where we get the nitrogen that we use. So the nitrogen that we're breathing, it just comes into our blood from the alveolus and then it leaves. So even though we need nitrogen for our DNA and RNA, even though we need nitrogen for the amino acids in our proteins, all those pink atoms, the air that we're breathing is not the source of the nitrogen. Now, the answer is then we have to get nitrogen from the food we eat. Actually, the only organisms which can convert the nitrogen in the air into a usable form are bacteria. And so what we call nitrogen fixation, taking nitrogen gas out of the air and making it a usable form, ammonia, nitrates, nitrites. These are things that only prokaryotes do, so they are extremely important. So as a result, if nitrogen, from the air comes into our plasma and we can't do anything with it and it then just leaves again, well, there's really not a whole lot that we need to say about nitrogen. The one thing that we do need to say involves scuba. And so if you ever are scuba diving or you're a healthcare worker near a coast, this is a problem. Just in general, when you increase pressure, more gas can dissolve in a liquid. And you know this from drinking soda, right? When the soda is under pressure, there's more bubbles in it, all right? Because under pressure, more gas can be dissolved in a solution. Once you open the soda can, all the gas leaves and soda goes flat. It doesn't have gas in it anymore. So as you increase pressure, more fluid dissolves in the soda. Now, as you then go scuba diving, then that's like making yourself a soda can. In a sense, you're going down. The pressure is greater because you've got all that ocean over you, right? And as a result, now more gas, especially nitrogen, the most common gas in air, more gas is then dissolved in your blood. All right, so that's fine. All right, but here you are. Here's me. So that now that you're underwater, there's just more gas bubbles dissolved in your blood plasma. There's me and my kids than there otherwise would be. All right. The problem is, if I rush to the surface, all right, because now at this depth, there's more gas dissolved in my blood, then all of a sudden at the surface with less pressure, all of this can't be dissolved anymore and it becomes little bubbles. Now, that's bad because having a solid, say, blood clot floating in your blood vessels, that's a problem because it can get stuck, block blood flow. So a solid clot is bad. But gas bubbles would be about the same. You don't want gas bubbles traveling in your capillaries because they can block blood flow as well. And so this would cause what's called decompression sickness. The decreased pressure, which we would then encounter here, would then, as we went to the surface, cause these bubbles to form, which would block blood flow here, all over the body, and because you can go into a coma and actually die. So if you're a scuba diver, you know that if you've been diving at a deep depth for a long time and you want to come to the surface, one, you have to go very slowly, all right? But then two, there will be timed stops. So you'll get to a certain depth and everyone says, all right, we have to stop here. And it's in our plan. We have to stop here for 5 minutes, for 3 minutes. And you're slowly letting the gas come out of your system. So you can't swim quickly up to the top at all, ever. And you can't, if you've been diving for a while deep, you can't go straight up. You have to wait here for the nitrogen to leave. And actually, if you're planning your dive, you know that probably the worst part of your scuba training was you had to learn all of those nitrogen tables. You had to say, all right, well, if I go down to this depth for such an amount of time, this much nitrogen will be in me. And so now I started off as an A diver, and now I'm going to now be like an F diver. And if I want to then go on a second dive, I can't. I can't go on a second dive. Somewhere there's the charts. All right, so you're actually going to say, like, so this much nitrogen is in my blood after I've, I've done this much. And now I have to say, if I want to, go on a second dive, well, we then go to the boat and then we now have to have lunch. We have to break for 3 hours, all right, so that as more of this nitrogen leaves my body, I then go back to being a sea diver. And as a sea diver, I can now get in the boat and then do a second dive for a certain amount of time. And if I was going to say do a night dive or whatever, well, I can't do it tonight, all right, because I have to then plan this around my flight, all right, so that I need to, if I'm going to now go up in altitude, I can't, go night diving and then take a morning flight the next day. And so this is important if you're scuba diving. And then if you are a healthcare worker near the coast, then this is something that you have to sometimes work with, and hospitals near the coast need decompression chambers for any divers who have come up too quickly, etc. So just a couple final points. Your respiratory system is something that your nervous system does have some control over. You, in addition to being able to voluntarily inhale or exhale, we have involuntary centers primarily in the medulla. All right, so here we have an inspiratory center, which is then going to send commands to the muscles which do inhales. All right, so my brain can tell me to inhale. And then we have a center which can then send commands to the muscles for exhaling. Here there are autorhythmic fibers, which can then create a rhythm on their own. And so thus the medulla has the primary respiratory centers. The pons also helps. And so there are some centers here, like the center which will, if I start to inhale, after a certain point I should stop. I shouldn't inhale too much, so it limits inspiration. And then also the center which governs the transition between the inhale and the exhale. So our primary respiratory centers are in the medulla, but then the pons also has centers as well. Now, as a result, just as we want to control our heart's output, we talked about cardiac output. Even though your heart is a pump, sometimes it pumps more than others. The same thing is true of the respiratory system, where we want to breathe, but we want to have a breathing rate which matches our body's needs. We don't want to be breathing too much or too little. And as we'll see in a future chapter, if we're breathing too little, that can cause acidosis. If we're breathing too much, that can cause alkalosis. We can die either way. All right. So, breathing inappropriately can be a serious problem. So how do you breathe just enough? Well, we have centers which are measuring how much oxygen there is, how much carbon dioxide there is, and how much acid there is in your blood. All right, we can measure these things. Like on your tongue, you measure acid. That's what you detect as a sour taste. Well, we not only can measure this in our mouth, we can measure chemicals throughout our bodies with what are called chemoreceptors. We have central chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata, and then we have peripheral chemoreceptors. So for example, in the aorta, in the place where the common carotid splits to make the internal and external carotid, what is called the carotid bodies in other vertebrates. Like in frogs, you see a little bulb there just for those. So how much carbon dioxide, oxygen, and acid is in your blood? Well, you actually know this because you're measuring this. You have receptors, and that's their job, to measure how much oxygen, carbon dioxide, and acid there is in your blood. And actually, of the three, the acid's the most powerful. So while we can change respiration based on any of those three, when we change our breathing rate, say during exercise, acid has perhaps been the main cause of that, that shift. Okay, so we're measuring how much acid, oxygen, carbon dioxide there is. And as a result, once your brain knows these, your brain now can change breathing rates, all right? And so let's say that I'm exercising and my acid level is now too high. I'm building lactic acid up in my tissues. My oxygen, my carbon dioxide levels are too high, and my oxygen levels are too low. My brain measures this, and then my brain then involuntarily changes my breathing rate during exercise. I'm breathing more frequently, I'm breathing deeper, all right? And so it was the high acid levels, the high carbon dioxide levels, and the high oxygen levels, which then stimulated this. Other things can then also increase breathing rate. So when I'm warmer, I breathe more. And then also if my proprioceptors are firing, if I'm just starting to move my body parts more, that will stimulate my respiratory system. So I will breathe more and breathe more frequently, breathe more deeply under these conditions. So high acid, high carbon dioxide, low oxygen, high temperature, increased proprioceptor activity. I will breathe less in the opposite. So if I'm sitting here at rest, I do not want to do this. I'm actually hyperventilating, and that could be bad. I mean, actually, I could die if I kept that up. And so there are times where I decrease my respiration. I will breathe less frequently, less deeply, and that happens when I have low acid levels, low carbon dioxide levels, when my oxygen levels are high. All right, I would lower my respiration. I also lower my respiration when I'm colder and when I'm not moving as much. All right. So in addition to the voluntary control I can hold my breath or breathe breathe voluntarily. My involuntary centers are also then changing my respiratory rate to meet my body's needs. I have other videos on the respiratory system. I'll make a separate comprehensive video on asthma. Because I have a number of videos on asthma. I have a few here on smoking. So for example, we know what lung tissue is supposed to look like. Lung tissue is supposed to have air sacs, but cigarette smoking and other chemical exposures can then trigger the loss of these air sacs. And that's what we see in emphysema. Emphysema, literally meaning empty chest, means that these air sacs, have been destroyed. So an emphysema patient is now struggling to breathe. They have fewer air sacs. After a certain point, this damage is permanent. And so we certainly don't want to whether it be smoking or exposure to chemicals, if your job exposes you to a lot, to have emphysema, where now you just have fewer air sacs that can perform gas exchange with the air sacs. All right, and so I have videos that explain that and then show you the microscope slides of the lungs in an emphysema patient versus a normal patient. And then also, if we're going to breathe in a lot of debris, that mucociliary response, it certainly attempts to catch all of this in mucus and sweep it towards, away from the lungs, but that doesn't always work. And so if you were to look at the lungs of a smoker, or say someone who worked in a coal mine and was constantly breathing in coal soot, a lot of this debris then ends up in the lungs and then becomes permanent there. And so here you see that many of the macrophages and dendritic cells of the lungs have taken in this foreign debris. Now this is bad, right? This will obviously exaggerate the inflammation of the lungs. These white blood cells will communicate the fact that they've taken up so much foreign material. But then a lot of the components which we can take up, say from cigarette smoke, are actually carcinogens. All right, and so then taking up this foreign material is not just bad for the lungs in general, but then also increasing the risk of a number of cancers, lung cancer, throat cancer, and a number of other cancers as well. Now, smoking obviously has many other effects on the body, and women who are pregnant. It increases the risk of birth defects and preterm delivery because nicotine is a vasoconstrictor. It increases blood pressure, which is an increased risk of heart disease. That's bad. This final video, it was a little sillier. I'm not quite sure, that the motivation was, the best guided. But one of the things I was just trying to illustrate was that we certainly want to avoid outdoor air pollution, and we want to avoid cigarette smoke. But sometimes the indoor air is actually worse than the outdoor air. Certainly if we're smoking, that can be true. But very often, let's say you just get new furniture, new carpets, new drapes, etc. Well, there's that new car smell, or all of these have smells. Well, they are doing what's called outgassing. They are producing these gases, but a lot of these gases are actually toxic All right, they include what are called volatile organic compounds. And so I just wanted to introduce the point that while we worry about outside air pollution, as we should, very often indoor air, like with cigarette smoke, or if there's outgassing of some of these other things, that's actually more dangerous. And so if we're worried about, exposures, which can, predispose us to respiratory disorders, for some individuals, it's the indoor air, which is actually their primary exposure to pollutants. So this has been an overview of the second half of a respiratory system chapter with respiratory system physiology.